Real Stories Tapes True Crime is your new true crime podcast fix. In our first season, we'll explore suspicious deaths at a California hospital and a skydiver landing dead on a suburban driveway with a bag containing guns, drugs, and night vision goggles. To join our investigation, search and subscribe to Real Stories Tapes True Crime on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts.
Within hours of being rushed to a West London hospital one cold January night in 2009, Lakhvir Singh would be dead, and his young fiancée would be clinging to life in intensive care. The couple showed every vicious symptom of being poisoned. Spurned lover Lakhvir Singh was identified by the police as the #1 suspect. Her unrelenting drive for revenge would see her cross continents to achieve it.
Although poisoning is a very, very unusual crime, the love triangle is a very common feature.
But police had a major problem. Exactly what poison had Lakhvir Singh used to murder? Lakhvir Singh was a married mother of 3, living in the vibrant West London borough of Southall.
She was married, but it was a loveless marriage, although she had 3 children. Her husband was older than her and they weren't getting on. Chima was a cleaner and he had been married, but his marriage had failed.
Nicknamed Lucky, Lakhvir Singh needed a place to live and soon found one by lodging with the Singhs. Attractive and accessible, Lakhvir soon fell for Chima's charms, igniting an enduring affair. Their passionate relationship continued even when Chima bought a place of his own in nearby Feltham.
Over the years, she came in and cooked and cleaned for him and generally looked after him, and they grew very close.
For 15 years, Lakhvir Singh carried out her double life, looking after her Southall husband, then travelling across town to visit Chima. She even had a front door key to his Feltham house. Lakhvir's devotion was unquestioning. She became pregnant twice by Chima and terminated both of them at his request. There was nothing, it seemed, she wouldn't do for Chima. But by October 2008, there was nothing she wouldn't do to him. Chima was facing family pressure to remarry and raise a family of his own.
He was 40, I think, at the time, when, it's not just in Indian culture, but it happens in all cultures, that, you're 40, it's about time you started, settling down, maturing, start a family.
Chima's family had found an ideal fiancé for him, 19-year-old Gurjeet Chung. Speaking no English and knowing scarcely another soul in England, Gurjeet made the daunting journey to London to join Chima. Chima had to end his affair with Lakhvir.
Lakhvir Singh was very distressed by the news. She'd had this long-term relationship. She'd had several abortions, that she'd become pregnant over the years by Lucky Chima and been devoted to him. And then she sees her life unravel. She's got a loveless marriage and her only love interest that she'd been devoted to was Lucky Chima, and it was all about to end.
He then presented her with the information that he was going to get married to a much, much younger girl that had come over from India, who was 19. Finished with Lakhvir, literally said, that's it, go.
But Lakhvir wouldn't go. She tried to convince Chima that their affair could continue regardless of his impending marriage to Gurjeet. After all, Lakhvir had been cheating on her husband for years. But Chima wasn't going to be dragged into this new love triangle. Surging with jealousy, Lakhvir spied on her ex-lover and his bride-to-be. When she saw the couple laying in bed together, Lakhvir threatened to burn down his house if he ever slept with his fiancée again.
She'd threatened, she'd begged, she cajoled, and then could just see no way that she was ever going to get the relationship back, and the life, as far as she was concerned, was ending.
She's very distressed, angry, upset, jealous.
From the cocktail of Lakhvir Singh's toxic emotions leached one burning desire: revenge.
A lot of a crime takes place involving relationships, the breakdown of relationships, and it usually is three people, and usually two males fighting over a woman. In this case, it was the shoe was on the other foot. It was the female who took revenge.
Despite a husband of her own who was now battling cancer, Lakhvir began putting her deadly scheme into place. In October 2008, she booked a trip to her motherland.
There was clearly planning, long-term planning. She travelled to India, and it may have been specifically to get this Indian aconite. She came back with the poison.
Indian aconite is a plant that grows in the mountainous areas of northern India. Botanists named it Aconitum ferox, Latin for fierce.
These plants are used in traditional herbal medicine, and they're used in low doses, but in higher doses they can be toxic.
Indian aconite is armed with a potent feature called pseudo-aconitine that makes death even more frightening.
They made a comment that poisoning from Aconitum ferox was the most poisonous and the most vicious of all the aconite species.
Still seething with spite 3 months after returning from India, on December the 8th, 2008, Lakhvir Singh decided to carry out her first attack on Chima and Gurjeet.
The motivation for Mrs. Singh are the traditional ones, in my opinion, which would be revenge, absolutely incandescent anger and hatred for Lucky Chima.
Lakhvir Singh, in the December, did her first effort to do away with her ex-lover and the new girlfriend, but didn't use enough of the poison.
It's not uncommon in a homicidal poisoning case, for the suspect to try out whatever they're choosing to use as a poison. It's often the case they need to determine the dose that is actually going to kill. So they might have a trial run in which they haven't used enough of the poison. So you might get a period of sickness, and then they increase the dose and try again.
Her first strike inflicted a painful sickness on Chima and Gurjeet, hospitalizing them and baffling doctors. Lakhvir watched from afar the debilitating effects of her poison on the couple.
They were both hospitalized for several weeks, and at that time, the hospital did not know what the cause of their illness was. So about 6 weeks later, then the police were very, very interested, knew something had happened, and knew it was definitely suspicious.
On January 28th, Lakhvir executed her second attempt. She packed her hellish herbs in a plastic bag and a key to Chima's house. Her mission was murder.
It's almost as if it was done through a haze of rage and emotion. Having frequent access to the house where the couple lived, she went into the house and went to the refrigerator where she knew that there was a supply of curry that they were planning to eat for supper that night in a plastic box.
Reaching into the fridge for the tub of curry, she lifted off the lid and mixed in some of her heinous herbs.
She was seen going into the refrigerator. It became obvious very quickly that she'd tampered with the food that they were going to eat.
Returning the tub of curry to its shelf, she shut the fridge and left the house. That night, she waited for Chima and Gurjeet to dine on a dish she had designed for death.
It is shocking when you look at the lengths of the planning. She decided quite clearly to murder 2 people.
Later that chilly January evening, Chima and Gurjeet sat down to eat. Chima, enjoying a healthy appetite, tucked into a larger portion. Their bodies digested the food, and within hours, they began to feel those frighteningly familiar sensations again. It started with Chima's face turning numb. The poison had triggered his internal nervous system to start shutting down.
The circumstances in which 2 people became very, very ill very, very quickly sounded some alarm bells.
But lucky Chima had time to telephone his sister and ask her to come round. And he also telephoned emergency services and said that he thought he'd been poisoned by his girlfriend. His sister came round with 2 of her sons, so they helped Lucky Chima go to the local hospital, and his fiancée was taken to hospital too.
The victims had arrived at hospital vomiting profusely. They also had other symptoms, such as the male was very pale and he was sweating. They had great difficulty walking because they'd become very weak, so they both had to be helped to walk. Once they were examined, and particularly the male, the hospital staff noticed that he was developing a very unusual cardiac arrhythmia.
Chima's condition was deteriorating fast. He was losing his vision, and his heart began beating erratically. Doctors were convinced he had been poisoned, but they couldn't determine with what kind.
The heart was working out of rhythm, and the testing was not normal, and it didn't seem to match any of the conditions that the hospital staff had normally come across. They thought the whole situation was unusual, and they also contacted the National Poisons Unit for advice as well.
Chima's organs were malfunctioning, depriving him of oxygen and gradually suffocating him from the inside. Within a matter of hours of being admitted to hospital, Lakhvir Chima was dead. The police now had a suspicious death to investigate and alerted the Crown prosecutors.
The police had difficulties because they did not know what the cause of death was, which is an unusual feature. Usually that isn't something that causes an issue. The pathologist will be at the scene of a crime or back at the mortuary, depending where the body's taken, and we'll get the pathologist's report pretty quickly. And they normally will say it's a stab wound, it's a blunt trauma to the head, or whatever it is. In this case, they were really stymied and didn't know. And the first thing they came to us and said, we're not sure what the cause of death was.
Forensic toxicologist Denise Stanworth was deployed to help identify the poison that caused Chima's death.
Well, the victims had eaten a meal about 2 hours before they became ill, and there were some remains, some leftovers from that meal. So this was obviously suspect, and this was sent in to us. This was the very first sample that was sent to us and was the best place to start our search for a poison.
Police, meanwhile, had turned their attention to Lakhvir Singh.
Unlike some defendants, she wasn't particularly surveillance savvy. A lot of criminals are well aware that if they're committing offences, they're very conscious of CCTV and take steps to hide their identity. She had no previous convictions or the like. That could then link her to the offence itself. So she didn't take any steps to wash her clothing or to destroy her clothing or destroy the evidence.
Police had found 2 bags of a herb-like substance, one in her coat pocket and one in her handbag. They sent these to forensics as well.
One interesting thing and one extremely crucial thing that we did find from this analysis was that we also analysed at the same time as the curry the herbal material that had been found in the suspect's pocket. We actually had a link then between the curry that was in the victim's house and the herbal substance that was on the suspect. So that is really important, really, in establishing our case.
Although the herbs linked Lakhvir to the scene of the crime, investigators had yet to link them to the cause of Chima's death.
We have to establish the cause of death. It's like a golden rule.
It's always important to find out what substance has been ingested, to get the level and to determine if it's fatal or not, in order for the pathologist to then decide on the cause of death. We had to produce results urgently, so there was that essence of pressure on us. It was also very challenging because we didn't really know what we were looking for.
For the investigators, identifying the poison was like looking for a needle in a haystack. A breakthrough came from the hospital, with news that Gurjeet had clung on to life.
Because the fiancé had taken a small amount of the poison, she was just hanging on to life by a thread, and the physicians put her into a medically induced coma, and that saved her life.
She's a complete innocent in all of this. Complete innocent. Naive. I'd only been in the country a short period of time, expecting to get married to this man, and the next thing she knows, she's hospitalised and subsequently has sustained life-changing injuries internally.
Gurjeet's account of the hours leading up to Chima's death provided investigators with invaluable clues.
We got additional information about these symptoms, and this is when she'd mentioned that her boyfriend had experienced numbness on his face, around his mouth and his lips. There are very few poisons that actually create numbness in this way. So it was at that point that we narrowed it down to possibly an aconite, and we started looking at symptoms that aconite cause.
Bizarrely, it was 18th century books that gave the forensic team the best lead.
Looking at the Victorian scientific literature, there were some very, very detailed accounts of aconite poisoning, and these described loss of vision as well as cardiac events. The vomiting, the weakness, the being unable to stand was also mentioned. And some of the more contemporary accounts of aconite poisoning don't actually mention loss of vision. So it was the Victorian literature which was particularly helpful in this case.
Toxicologists were closing in on the identity of Lakhvir's plant of devastating pain. They examined its molecular makeup and found a culprit they had never encountered before. To be certain they had the right plant, the team sent samples of the herb to the Royal Botanical Gardens in Kew for analysis. They scored a perfect match.
It was such a relief to be able to give the results on this case and to be able to actually say that these poor individuals had been poisoned, and to be able to say pretty much exactly what that poison was.
I've got a call from our pathologist who'd just been in contact with Q to say that it's an aconite. I'd never heard of aconite before. He then said it grows here, but it's not of the same toxicity. And we've found it, and it comes from Upper Pradesh in India. And it's a root found growing in the mountains. And surprise, surprise, Lakhvir's from that area as well. So, we've got one piece of evidence that we absolutely had to have. It was essential. And we got it.
Nearly a year after the attack, Lakhvir Singh stood trial at the Central Criminal Court at the Old Bailey. She was accused of first-degree murder of Lakhvinder Chima and the attempted murder of Gurjit Chung.
What we do know about Gurjit is that at the trial she said how horrifying the experience was, and that she was in a country where she didn't know anyone, she didn't speak the language, and there she was suddenly at death's door, and how terrifying that was for her.
I think once we were able to establish the breakdown of the relationship, I wouldn't say it was easy to convince the jury, but it had all the hallmarks of a classic case of jealousy.
Lakhvir Singh sat in the dock and awaited her fate.
Very subdued, very quiet. I just think the enormity of it all, perhaps it didn't register with her.
I don't often look at the defendant when I'm in court. Usually they're not in my line of vision, but I did take a look at her to see. I was curious to see what sort of lady would do this, but she expressed no emotion. I was perplexed about whether or not she really intended to kill. I did wonder about her state of mind, about her motives. It was really a very violent and nasty poison, particularly potent poison to use.
On February the 11th, 2010, Lakhvir Singh was found guilty. She was sentenced to life imprisonment.
In this case, I think for Lakhvinder's family, I'm pleased that we got the conviction, and indeed for Chuma's, of course, and for her.
The impact of her actions is clearly that she left her husband, who was very ill with cancer. They had 3 children, and she went to prison, so her family was broken. And then the obvious impact in the death of Lucky Chima and the very near death of his fiancée.
In May 1979, in the small town of Fairview, Tennessee, police gathered to exhume the body of one of the past residents, William Hayes. An investigation has caused them to suspect William Hayes may not have died of natural causes, but was the victim of foul play. Investigators braced themselves for a grisly and horrific sight. Hayes had been buried 5 years earlier. But to their surprise, they looked upon a near-perfect body. The condition of the corpse, however, belied the long, cruel death William Hayes had been subjected to at the hands of his wife.
Her name was Ada Laverne Hayes Wittenmeyer, and I dubbed her to be the Lonely Hearts Club murderess. She preyed upon what she always does, love.
You're being poisoned by somebody you trust.
Born in July 1945 in Dixon County, Tennessee, Ada was impatient for wealth. To acquire it, she set her sights on catching the big fish, men with assets, whom she would ensure left plenty to her. By the time she was 26, Ada had already been married and divorced. She was a woman on the move, prepared to travel the path of wherever the Lonely Hearts advertisements would take her. However, she wasn't looking for love. She was looking for a victim. Her new target was 46-year-old William Clifford Hayes.
Bill Hayes, or William Hayes, worked in a furniture manufacturing facility in Nashville. They worked at the same location at the same factory.
He was basically a regular person. He seemed to have a good family. And for some reason, apparently, she targeted him.
William lived in the small green town of Fairview, Tennessee. He continued to live there after he and Ada married in 1971. But after a few years of marriage, signs of strain started to show. Ada was preparing to cash in.
They weren't getting along. It was just a life insurance policy through his employment, but it was only $18,000. It wasn't a huge amount.
She was getting everything together, trying to get the assets there, get this taken care of, get the insurance policies, make sure they're all up to speed. And, you know, some of those things take time.
Ada picked her weapon: arsenic-based rat poison. Arsenic prevents cells from carrying out tasks that keep the brain working and the heart and lungs pumping. With time, it causes cell death and hemorrhaging, rendering the victim helpless, drowsy, and in crippling pain.
Well, back then, you could go to any store just about and get rat poison.
William started to get sick.
He would get very sick, have to go into the hospital. When he was there, he was eating hospital food, and he would get better. And then he'd go back home, and he'd get sick again.
He basically was concerned about having discussions with his family, that I don't know what's wrong with me. I want to know what's wrong with me because it needs to be determined so someone else can get helped after I pass. What a man, a good man. Fluid would come out of him, you know, just be terrible, where he couldn't work and he would be in the bed. And there was some degrees of nausea.
William's teenage daughter Jeanette was alarmed and suspicious of what was causing her father's health to dangerously fluctuate.
She was concerned because why is my dad getting sick? And why is he back in the hospital? Why is this happening? Why is he better when he's in the hospital than he is at home? And it's strange. And he was getting sicker. He couldn't eat solid foods. Apparently, he was receiving arsenic in his split pea soup.
Ada wanted to get away from Jeanette's astute concern. So despite William's ailing condition, Ada decided to move house and return to her childhood neighborhood in Dickson County. Less than 2 months later, William arrived at Goodlark Hospital.
When he was carried into the hospital in Dickson County, He was wearing a diaper, had extreme problems controlling his bowel movement, and was in emaciated condition. Unfortunately, they didn't do anything to investigate at that time at the hospital about what had caused his death. Nobody knew for sure that he had been poisoned.
You can look at it this way. If you've got a dog and you want a Bobby's tail, you can either whack it off once, or you can a little bit here, a little bit here, a little back here. And she chose that, to punt this poor man like that.
William died on July 22nd, 1974, and was laid to rest back in Fairview at Harpeth Hills Cemetery. It wasn't long before Ada was looking for her next meal ticket. So she scoured her favourite resource, a magazine for singles looking for love.
Back then, have to find men through the Lonely Hearts Club situation, where you could post on there through the post, or you could put it in a newspaper or what have you. And she developed the situation where she could find men, preferably if they had no real heirs, which she would be desired to be with. But even if they had some.
Ada, now 33, found the ideal target. 59-year-old John Wittenmeyer, a widowed ranch owner with a single heir, based in the neighboring state of Oklahoma. By May 16, 1976, they were married.
Obvious of what she was doing, what her scheme was up to. She wanted to impress that man, say that she's a good woman, I'll be good to you, I'll cook for you, I'll iron for you, I'll make sure everything is the way you want it to be. But it's just the opposite. She wanted it all to be her way.
Less than 2 years later, John Wittenmeyer petitioned for divorce. But Ada waited until the following March before she struck.
There was a will that Mr. Wittenmeyer had written out, probably at the request of Ada. She needed the time to do this and do this and do this. And when that will was done on the 27th, I believe it was, then that's probably when he got the big dose, and he's dead the next day.
John Wittenmeyer was 62. While Ada had trickled arsenic into unsuspecting William, she wielded a viciously abrupt attack on Wittenmeyer. She now had form. She knew the hit required to kill, and was confident enough to execute her plan in one maliciously calculated attack.
Mr. Wittenmeyer in Oklahoma, it was one full dose. Bam. Unlike Mr. Hayes, it was one big shot of it. It was the whole thing, other than stringing it out.
She initially called her attorney and had him come out to the house. And then they called the funeral home and asked the funeral director to come pick up the body. And the funeral director said the sheriff had to come to the scene and investigate it to some extent, find out what he could about it. The sheriff was called, he went out, and there was an holographic will lying on the nightstand beside the bed when the officers got there. It was leaving control of the ranch to Ada. At that time, he instructed Ada not to leave the state of Oklahoma or the local jurisdiction.
And then the next day she left, I believe it was. And then on April the 2nd, I believe she was headed towards Tennessee.
The Oklahoma investigators alerted the district attorney's office in Tennessee.
Well, we were told that, and then the investigator from Oklahoma had talked to William Hayes' daughter. And the daughter had suspicions that William Hayes had been poisoned here in Tennessee. Along with the Oklahoma investigators, we began to try to determine if that was the case.
We didn't have anything other than the fact that he was dead and he was in the grave. So we put our heads together and we made the decision that we need to find out exactly what and who killed this man. So we petitioned the court and discussed with the family, and we went to the graveyard and we exhumed the body.
By now, William Hayes had been buried for 5 years. The investigators did not relish seeing the condition of his body.
Before we could open the coffin, there was a key. And they opened the key and raised the coffin, and there Mr. Hayes was. I'll never forgive it. And he was laying there, and he looked like he had passed away the day before.
There was no decomposition, hardly, on the body. And one possible explanation of that would, if you were given a large amount of arsenic, it would preserve the body to some extent.
William Hayes's body underwent an autopsy.
Our forensic man was in Memphis, Tennessee, Dr. Francisco. And in his report, he indicated that he died from ingesting arsenic, and he had at least 1,000 doses more than he'd ever seen. That, again, makes you cringe. So somebody to do something like that, particularly a loved one that, or you think that they love you, and it's all about money.
Suspicions reached an all-time high and started to focus on widow Ada Hayes Wittenmeyer.
My blood was boiling, and so was my boss, and we said, it's time to get her. We have got to find out where she is, what's happening, and she needs to be indicted and be answerable for this if we have the evidence to convict her.
But Ada was no longer in Tennessee. She was north of the border in Canada, where she'd been working on another victim, a well-off grain farmer.
She had met an individual in Canada and was corresponding with him.
Then we found out that this man had been sending money to her. He was up in Canada and thinking, according to what she told him, that she was trying to get some estates.
He didn't know she was charged with murder, and he didn't know about Mr. Wittenmeyer in Oklahoma, that he had died and she had been charged in Oklahoma. He had been sending her money by money orders and checks.
She was just like a fox. And he, I believe in his soul, that she was not a criminal.
Ada was extradited to Oklahoma, where she was charged with John Wittenmeyer's murder. By 1984, she was flying to Nashville. Her trial for the murder of William Hayes would take place at the Dickson County Courthouse in her hometown of Charlotte. From the outset, she tried to con her way out of a conviction, starting with her guard, Linda Mayo.
Linda Mayo, who is now deceased, was the guard bringing her back. She told Linda that she was pregnant by Jesus and was going to have his baby. And I think this was setting up an insanity defense.
In the summer of 1984, the trial began.
She came to court wearing a pair of high-back Gallus overalls over her dress and put on quite a show there. She pretended to have a heart attack in court. We had to recess court and send her to the hospital.
During the trial, she several times feigned like she was dying, having a heart attack, and she would fall and slip and slide in her chair like something's wrong, and she would come in different days with crazy hair and clothes. If I recall, there was a few times when she would be doing things that she shouldn't be doing, and he'd use the gavel just a little bit and say, "Ma'am, sit in your seat, sit in your seat." She had the abilities to give the sign of what she wants to anybody at any time. In other words, she can feign happiness, sadness, craziness, and I saw all those sides of her, all of them.
Despite being in custody, Ada was still trying to milk men for their money.
When she was actually on trial for Hayes' murder, she got a letter through her sister that contained a check and came from this man and had his address, and we got a telephone number for him. I called him that night after court recess and asked him how he knew Ada Wittenmeyer. And he said, well, he had met her through a Lonely Hearts. They had been corresponding.
District Attorney Atkins received yet another striking phone call during the course of the trial.
During the trial, I was contacted by the psychiatrist at the state prison, and he told me of this lady that he had talked to that said Ada had confessed the murder to her. And he said, you need to get that lady down there for the trial, which we then entered an order to bring her in as a witness. And she testified that Ada had told her about the murder. She had told her about the Oklahoma murder also. She said Ada was going to pretend to be crazy and have an insanity defense to the murder.
On August 2nd, 1984, Ada faced the jury's verdict.
Then I finally turned this over and said, that's what needs to happen here today, ladies and gentlemen of the jury.
Ada Wittenmeyer was found guilty of murder and was sentenced to life in jail. Aged 39, she was taken back to the DeBerry Correctional Facility in Nashville to serve out her time. Nearly 10 years after William Hayes died, his family at last saw Ada account for his cruel death.
Happy. Justice was served. You know, it's really great for the family and for other people seeing that a poor, innocent man gets poisoned and she has to answer for that.
A week after Ada's conviction, Dan Cook received news from the DeBerry Correctional Facility.
We were advised that she was dead, and so we wanted to determine what was happening and what occurred there. And it was my understanding that she hung herself using the sheets, pillowcases, or whatever, the warden or someone up there said she left you a love note. Basically, I'll never forgive it because she said, "General Cook, I've been trying to tell you all through this trial, all through these days, that I was insane. And I want you to know that if you have children, I hope they're not insane like me. And by the way, my blood is on you." And I just said, well, we got the death penalty. I know that's tough. I'm sorry that she killed herself, but look what she did to men and how many could have been there. And that's up between her and the good Lord.